Chemicals of organisms. We're going to start with inorganic chemicals of organisms. Inorganic chemicals are non-living matter, but they play an important role in living organisms. We're going to look at water, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and inorganic salts as examples of inorganic chemicals. First, we're going to look at water. About 2/3 of our weight remains liquid in our bodies. Organisms in general are composed of 70 to 90% water. It's a really important inorganic chemical. We'll look at several of the chemical properties of why water is so important and how it's able to do what it does in our bodies. Water transports substances within and out of the body. They are cohesive molecules that stick together. It absorbs and transports heat, usually keeping us from overheating. Think of evaporative coolers or swamp coolers. Sweat works in the same way. Again, we'll look at the chemical properties of water that allows it to do this. The first property of water to look at is that water has a high heat capacity. If we're looking at the concept of heat capacity, we use calories as a measurement. A calorie is the amount of heat energy that's needed to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius. The hydrogen bonds that link water molecules help absorb heat without a great change in temperature. As we were looking at, hydrogen bonds form between partially negative oxygen and partially positive hydrogen, and that they were weak individually but strong collectively. Here is one of the ways that that strength in numbers works to their advantage. So, the practical application of water having a high heat capacity is that the temperature of water rises and falls slowly. And with much of our bodies being composed of water, organisms such as ourselves are better able to maintain their normal internal temperatures. Being composed mostly of water is a great passive way to help maintain homeostasis. Water is the universal solvent. And if we're talking about a solvent, it's going to be a substance that we dissolve other substances within. So within a solution, you have the solvent, which is the main component, and the dissolved substances are called solutes. Water, we saw previously, is a polar molecule. We have polar covalent bonds between the oxygen and hydrogen atoms. Due to that polarity, water facilitates chemical reactions both outside and within living systems. It dissolves many chemical substances. If something is hydrophilic, then it's going to be attracted to water. Hydrophobic molecules do not attract water. Hydrophilic comes from the word hydro, meaning water, and philic, meaning loving. So hydrophilic is something that's water loving. So this is also going to be something that is polar due to the chemical nature of water. If something is hydrophobic, the molecules do not attract water. Phobic, if you think of phobias or fears. So hydrophobic is water fearing. This helps explain why oil and water do not mix, because with oil, as we'll see later, is nonpolar, whereas water is polar, so they're going to repel one another. An example of something that would be hydrophilic and would dissolve in water, sodium chloride, table salt. If you take salt, you can dissolve it in water, and this is what happens. You have these sodium ions that are positively charged, can then be attracted to this partially negative portion of oxygen within the water molecule, and just the opposite happens with the chloride ion. The chloride ion has a negative charge, and so this partially positive charge here on the polar molecule of water can then help dissolve that chloride ion. Another property of water is that water has a high heat of vaporization. That means that it takes a lot of energy to turn liquid water into gaseous water. If we think back to the states of matter, we talked about solid, liquid, gas, and plasma. So to convert 1 gram of the hottest water to a gas requires an input of 540 calories of heat energy. This is why steam burns are so bad, because there's a lot of energy within steam. Because of the high heat of vaporization of water, this gives animals in a hot environment an efficient way to release excess body heat. So when we sweat, we're giving off a lot of heat within those water molecules. This is also why water helps moderate temperatures along coast or any large bodies of water. If you think of areas near water as compared to those away from water, the temperature rises and falls more slowly. And this is also why if you live in a more humid environment, you don't have as drastic a temperature change within the day. Or conversely, if you live in a very dry environment, why you can have such a great fluctuation in temperature throughout the day. Another interesting property of water is that frozen water, that solid form of water, ice, is less dense than liquid water, so it floats. You might think if something was solid, as we were looking at the characteristics of matter earlier, and that atoms tend to be closer together, that it might sink to the bottom. But this is because water expands as it freezes, because a crystal lattice forms with the hydrogen bonds farther apart. As liquid water cools, the molecules come closer together, and at 4 degrees Celsius is when water is the most dense and those molecules are closest together. It looks like this. So again, this dotted line represents a hydrogen bond. As water becomes a solid, these water molecules are further apart and they form this crystalline lattice structure. And this is why ice is less dense than liquid water. Here we can see the molecules are closer together in a drop of liquid water. Looking at other inorganic molecules, oxygen, represented as O2. Earlier we saw this as a diatomic molecule with a double covalent bond. So oxygen, one of the ways that our bodies use it, it's carried by hemoglobin on red blood cells, which is called oxyhemoglobin, and it releases energy from glucose. This is a picture of red blood cells here. Carbon dioxide, another inorganic molecule represented as CO2, is a waste product of respiration, also combines with hemoglobin to be transported to lungs to be expelled. This is a representation of the hemoglobin protein itself. Our last inorganic molecule to look at is inorganic salts. They're abundant throughout organs and fluids. They release ions that are necessary for transporting substances in and out of cells, contraction of muscles and conduction of nerve impulses, for example. Some examples of these salts include sodium chloride, potassium sulfate, and magnesium sulfate. Earlier, when we were looking at decomposition reactions, we saw how we have molecules that are broken into simpler substances. So if we have sodium chloride, that can be broken down into a sodium ion and a chloride ion, for example. And keeping in mind that ions are charged particles as represented by this positive or negative charge here. Potassium sulfate breaks apart in a similar fashion so that you have positive potassium ions and negative sulfate ions. Magnesium sulfate breaks apart in a similar fashion so that you have magnesium ions and sulfate ions. So again, we're noticing that ions, kind of a review here, are charged particles, and that whether it's a positive 1, if there's nothing after this positive or negative, a 1 is implied. Otherwise, you'll see 2, 3, 4, etc. to let you know of the imbalance between protons and electrons. Lipids, our next type of organic molecule, they contain more energy per gram than other biological molecules. There's 3 types that we'll look at particularly. Fats and oils used for energy storage, phospholipids from membranes, and steroids, including sex hormones. Lipids don't have a specific monomer as we see with carbohydrates, proteins, and nucleic acids. This is because lipids are really diverse in their structure and function. However, lipids do have some common characteristics. Lipids do not dissolve in water. They're hydrophobic and they repel water molecules. They all contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. The hydrogen to oxygen ratio is always greater than 2 to 1. We saw that 2 to 1 ratio in carbohydrates. Fats and oils are a type of lipid, and for a triglyceride that we have a glycerol and 3 fatty acids, they can be joined together in this dehydration reaction. So highlighted here are these components of water that after this dehydration reaction form this bond and leave us with water molecules. And again, we have the reverse of that, a hydrolysis reaction in which the components of water are added in order to break apart those bonds. Phospholipids are comprised of 2 fatty acids and a phosphate group. The phosphate group is polar, so the molecules are not electrically neutral. And the phosphate group forms a polar head, which is going to be hydrophilic, while the rest of the molecule is a nonpolar or hydrophobic tail. Phospholipids are a major component. Phospholipids are a major component of the cell membrane, and they spontaneously form this bilayer or 2-layer in which the hydrophilic heads face outward towards the watery solutions and the tails form the hydrophobic interior. When we look at plasma membranes in later units, we'll see this again. But the polar head, remember that water is a polar molecule, and so there's some kind of charge there. So this is going to be hydrophilic or water-loving. So interior and exterior of a cell typically have water or an aqueous environment. So that's why these polar heads or phosphates groups are going to be oriented toward the inside and outside of the cell, whereas these fatty acid tails are nonpolar or hydrophobic and are going to face towards one another, forming a hydrophobic interior layer of a plasma membrane. Steroids are another type of lipid. They have a backbone of 4 fused carbon rings. Examples of steroids are cholesterol, testosterone, and estrogen. Proteins are polymers composed of amino acid monomers. So amino acids, you have an amino group and an acidic group. And so amino group here, acidic group here, and then this R represented here of an amino acid is just a functional group, and that's going to vary according to what type of protein you have. So highlighted here are some examples of different R groups or functional groups, and they form different amino acids. Proteins perform many functions. There are structural proteins that give support, such as keratin and collagen within your nails and your hair and your skin. Enzymes speed up chemical reactions. They're catalysts. They can be an energy source. Some proteins act as hormones and are chemical messengers. Actin and myosin within our muscles, they move cells and muscles. Some proteins transport molecules within our blood, such as hemoglobin. Antibodies protect cells And channel proteins allow substances to cross membranes. So there are a lot of functions of proteins. Proteins, amino acids that are the monomers of proteins are joined together by peptide bonds. And so again, as we've seen with some of our other molecules, if we have two different amino acids and highlighting these components of water, if we go through a dehydration reaction, we get a dipeptide, two peptides that are joined together, and a water molecule. This is a peptide bond that exists between a carbon and a nitrogen atom. And a polypeptide, so poly meaning many, polypeptide, is a single chain of amino acids. So it's going to be several amino acids that are joined together by these peptide bonds between carbon and nitrogen. And similar to what we've seen too, in order to break that peptide bond, we can add the components of water in a hydrolysis reaction. The final shape of a protein is very important to its function. Form and function go hand in hand in biology, and we'll see that on several levels. If a protein is denatured when it loses structure and function. This happens when proteins are exposed to extreme heat or pH. So an extreme pH would be something that's really acidic or really basic or alkaline. An example of this is when we make Jell-O. Nucleic acids are our last type of organic compound that we're going to look at. They control cellular activity. They always contain carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, and phosphorus. There are two types of nucleic acids, DNA and RNA. DNA is deoxyribonucleic acid. It stores genetic information in the cell and in the organism. DNA replicates to transmit its information when a cell divides or organisms reproduce. We'll look a lot into this later. RNA is ribonucleic acid and is similar to DNA in that it can control cellular activity and stores genetic information. Both DNA and RNA are polymers of nucleotides. So the nucleotide is the monomer. DNA or RNA nucleic acids are the polymers. Every nucleotide is a molecular complex of a phosphate, a pentose sugar, and a nitrogen-containing base. The pentose sugar is going to be ribose or deoxyribose, so DNA or RNA. The nitrogen-containing base, if it's DNA, it can be adenine, thymine, guanine, or cytosine. In RNA, you have uracil instead of thymine. Here's a look at the nucleotide structure. So we have the phosphate represented here, the pentose sugar, and the nitrogen-containing base that can be one of those 5 that we just looked at depending on what it is. Here are some differences and similarities between DNA and RNA in Table 2.2. You can review this information now, but we'll get into it in more detail in later units. Nucleotides form a linear molecule called a strand. DNA is going to be a double helix of 2 strands. The 2 strands are held together by hydrogen bonds. The rungs of the latter are formed by complementary paired bases. Adenine always pairs with thymine, and cytosine always pairs with guanine. It looks like this in a DNA molecule. So again, we have adenine pairing with thymine, and these dashed lines representing hydrogen bonds, or guanine always pairing with cytosine, and here we have this triple hydrogen bond.